Darksiders was one of the many hack-and-slash style games that was prominent on the PS3 Xbox 360 console generation. An adventure game with a lot of edge to it that would make your average Reaper main blush. It's set in the premise of the eternal battle between heaven and hell, where you play as one of the horsemen of the apocalypse, War. Darksiders came out at a very interesting time, especially in 2010, where the gaming market was extremely heavy with action-adventure games like Dante's Inferno, Enslaved Odyssey to the West, Castlevania Lords of Shadow, and the biggest, most acclaimed heavy hitter of them all, God of War 3. A year with plenty of action games to choose from, players got to have their pick of the litter, though not all games were as equally fun, and a few paled in comparison. Darksiders, however, managed to stand out thanks to its original world and interesting combination of inspired systems from The Legend of Zelda, God of War, and even a tiny bit of Devil May Cry mixed in, though it lacks some of the wacky wahoo pizza man's charm. Woo! It was even successful and popular enough that 2 major sequel games and a few spin-offs were made. Though it didn't take top awards for that year, especially when you had games like Mass Effect 2, God of War 3, Amnesia: The Dark Descent, and Red Dead Redemption leading the charge, Darksiders was nevertheless a fun action-adventure game for a lot of people. But after 15 years, and luckily getting some accessible remasters for the game, how does Darksiders feel to play today? The story of Darksiders takes the conceptual premise of the eternal conflict between heaven and hell. In order to ensure both teams are playing fair, a group known as the Charred Council maintains the balance between the two, as well as foreseeing the rise of humans as being an integral part of the eternal conflict. Before they become capable of joining the fight, 7 seals were made to ensure their protection until such a time came. Once the humans become prepared and all of the seals were broken, the final conflict would begin, and the 4 horsemen would ride into battle. When the game begins, the end war has apparently begun, and all hell is let loose on Earth. Man, how am I supposed to get to work today? War has been summoned to the conflict as foretold, but something has gone terribly wrong. It turns out the final seal was not broken, and War has been summoned prematurely to battle, and is unable to make full use of his powers. Also, the humans are clearly not prepared for this. Like, seriously.
Nice throw!
After nearly losing his life to a demon, War is summoned back to the Charred Council under treason for siding with Hell and starting the apocalyptic war early. He makes his case to find the culprit behind his supposed transgression, thus beginning his journey on Earth to find those responsible, while also being kept under a leash by the Charred Council. A century has passed, and Earth is now a wasteland teeming with the forces of Hell that War has to contend with. I do like the backdrop of Darksiders, and the concept of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse is rarely used as a main plot device in most video games. In fact, I'm pretty sure the Darksiders series is the only series that prominently features their concept as the main protagonists. There are a few games that do feature the heaven versus hell scenario, particularly Diablo, where a third race or faction is often the ones affected, or that they are the deciding factors in the war. Darksiders does follow this plot method pretty closely, as War himself is essentially that third faction. But rather than trying to resolve the conflict, War is more concerned with why the end war has started, no pun intended, and figuring out who is responsible for his supposed transgression. I think this is what makes Darksiders unique. The world and its backdrop feels as original as can be, while giving the game, and even the franchise, its own identity, even today. The way the main story is conveyed, though, is on the simple side, but at least it's told in a way that's dramatic enough to make it feel interesting to listen to. A large portion of the game is mainly used for dramatic build-up of the story, along with some subtle foreshadowing.
Tell him, Watcher, how you stifle the horseman's true power in order to keep him on the council's leash.
Subtle foreshadowing. For nearly 70% of it, you're largely dealing with Samael, who agrees to help you take down the main villain, the Destroyer, what a name, in exchange for helping free him. During this time, the exchanges that you have with Samael, the Watcher, Vulgrim, and some of the bigger denizens scattered throughout the wasteland provide some foreshadowing along with a bit of world building as to those who are responsible for wronging War. Once you are finished helping Samael and you're at the Destroyer's tower, much of the plot is revealed regarding what happened at the start of the End War. Spoilers ahead, by the way. I say it's okay as far as revelations go for the story, but it does feel like it's really trying for that dramatic plot twist storytelling element, especially when it's revealed that Abaddon was the schemer this entire time, and the council was in on it as well. Oh, and he's the one that becomes the destroyer. War himself, while sort of cool looking and imposing, very much sticks to his lawful personality of adhering to the balance that is to be maintained even in the end of days. He is very stoic and unwavering, which is kind of necessary since he is the avatar of war. But his character is contrasted nicely with some of the more devious and hellish personalities that are prevalent in the game. It also helps that the voice acting is actually well done for each of the characters, especially when you have big names like Mark Hamill, Liam O'Brien, and Phil Lamar lending their voices to the mostly villain-esque writing of the game.
Let's lay down a few ground rules. Until this is over, you're a dog on a leash. I say bark, you bark. And if I have to kick you, you'd better not bare your teeth. Understand?
Oh, such haste to die. You aren't even a shadow of your former self. You wouldn't last a heartbeat. Besides, the way to the tower is shrouded by demon magics. Even I do not know the way.
There is little you can keep from me, horseman. Once I have a mind to know it.
And what do you know of Uriel?
I thought the horsemen were above such earthly pursuits.
I definitely think this is what really helps give the game a bit more character and personality to not make it feel so monotone and dated. Not a bad story overall, and it fits the dark adventure of Darksiders, no pun intended, pretty well. I think there could have been a little more plot reveal and intrigue in some of the earlier parts of the game for better build-up, but that might just be my personal taste. There's a few plot holes that are a little confusing, like how the heck does War lose his horse, and why the hell is it with this jobber, but nothing else that would demerit the story. As far as the game goes, if you're not trying to look for some deep writing, the story of Darksiders still felt entertaining enough to keep my attention, but I wouldn't call it its biggest selling point. If you are invested in the world, I do think the vibe of Darksiders is unique to itself. The gameplay can be simply boiled down to two games, God of War and The Legend of Zelda. Okay, next topic. Okay, wait, there's a bit more to explain over here. Darksiders has two distinct gameplay systems that run the course of the entire game. You have the combat system as well as the adventuring system. When it comes to combat, Darksiders employs a hack-and-slash system where War can perform a small variety of combo moves. It's very typical fighting game character action style where you have a few moves that can focus on a single target, larger group attacks, or bring them to the air for some hang time combos. If I had to give a level of combat complexity to compare, where Devil May Cry 5 is kind of the 10 out of 10 when it comes to the sheer amount of movesets you can do, and the very first God of War is a 7 out of 10 in terms of simple but wide array of moves and abilities, Darksiders is a 4 out of 10 for me. The movesets feel fun but extremely basic when it comes to stringing together combos, as well as incorporating some of the other weapons that you can utilize. It's not bad by any means, and if you're honestly one for mindless hacking and slashing, then Darksiders will gladly scratch that itch. But because of the lack of variety and complexity, it can start to feel repetitive. Plus, combat doesn't really evolve over the course of the game. You do get a myriad of additional weapons that War can use, but the game doesn't really give you any incentive to use them as part of your combat arsenal, and some of them feel more integral to the adventuring portion of the game. More on that in a bit. It doesn't help that the overall control of the combat feels rather clunky. Moves like the harpoon attack, which is basically just Dante's Stinger attack, can actually come out late sometimes, even when you delay your attack by just a few microseconds. When you're sometimes ready to charge your glaive for another ranged attack, holding the trigger preemptively doesn't actually activate it, and you have to press it again. A lot of the combat and weapon usage feel like cool concepts and ideas that the devs included, but the actual execution and refinement are lacking in making them feel fun and practical. It also doesn't help that the enemy types, outside of the bosses, are all extremely basic, and lack any meaningful variety even as the game goes on. In fact, it's really repetitive and kind of insulting how they simply reskin a few of the angels and demons just for the sake of making them look different in the later part of the game, with pretty much no gameplay changes at all. This is why any of the alternate weapon types, which could add some variety to the gameplay, just don't feel fun to use, because all of the enemies have the same set pattern of surrounding you, and the most effective method is to just simply swing your sword and dodge or block them when needed. Now, I could blame it on age, but mind you, God of War 1 and Devil May Cry 3 came out back in 2005, and those games have never lost their luster with making combat feel fun because of how precise their controls feel, as well as how those games focus on creating various pressures to ensure combat isn't just a static button mash. As a complement to the combat, Darksiders uses a similar upgrade system to DMC and God of War, where you can spend your soul currency on weapons, combo upgrades, and items. The melee weapons also get upgraded passively if you use them in combat. Considering that I only used the Chaos Eater Blade, well, that was the only weapon that saw a max upgrade by the end of the game, and every other weapon were just my disappointing children.
Larry, what the hell are you doing?
I don't hate the combat of Darksiders per se, but it's more of a letdown that the potential for some extremely fun and layered combat could have been there. With just a bit more refinement and execution to the mechanics, it would keep the normal gameplay from feeling overly repetitive. Also, if you're curious about difficulty, decide whether you want to take a hit with this much health or this much health.
What the fuck?
On the other side of gameplay is the adventuring portion, and this page is taken pretty much directly from the 3D Legend of Zelda books. You have the basic overworld, where you get to set out for each of the different locations that Samael asks you to go to, and each of them have their very distinct regions and dungeon-like areas. You're usually just exploring them, fighting enemies, finding keys to unlock doors, and finding the unique key item that you need to help clear them. Very much the dungeon formula from The Legend of Zelda. Heck, it even copies the top and bottom black bars when you lock on to enemies. The game even gives its own melodic charm when a puzzle is solved. Even the bosses themselves have the same puzzle-style encounters where you have to use the dungeon-specific key item as the solution to defeat them. Also, it just occurred to me that the Watcher is basically Na'vi, but now sounds like the animated Joker.
Over here! Silitha's lair must lie beyond that sticky barrier.
And people say I'm crazy.
If you like that style of puzzle solving and exploring, then Darksiders will help scratch that itch, as it actually borrows the formula decently well for the most part. I sort of enjoyed it because of the way it handles its platforming and exploring, as well as finding the puzzle gimmicks to defeat the bosses. The thing is though, while it tries to mimic the Zelda-style dungeoning in its own way, it also feels kind of bland and lacking some depth with the puzzle solving. There are some that stood out for me though, like how you have to run away with Ruin from the giant worm while you're shooting at it, or how the mini-boss requires you to have played Portal prior to playing this game.
Are you still there?
But the majority of the other puzzles just feel rather bland and obvious to solve. Maybe I'm just thinking that the puzzles were too easy, or that they lack some creative thinking behind solving them, but similar to the combat, it just feels like the dungeons and their puzzles didn't feel as great as they could have been. There's even some jank with some of them that honestly left me a little frustrated and made me think I was doing something wrong. Though I wonder if this is because of the PC port itself just having issues. Oh, and this may sound nitpicky, but during the portal puzzles, how the heck are you supposed to know that you can shoot portals through a portal?
Huh?
Or that the abyssal chain, aka the hookshot, which is what it should just be called anyway, needs to be used on a demon growth to access one of the sword pieces when the game never indicates that you could do this. Okay, I'm definitely just ranting. As for the other parts of the game, the overworld is really just there as a hub. Because of the lack of NPCs or characters, they kind of feel empty and not just in a story sense. Prior to unlocking the fast travel points, all you really do is go from place to place, and your only real obstacles are some fodder enemies that just get in your way. There's a lot of places that you can go to, but not much to really do or look for. Sure, there are some secrets that you can find when you have to backtrack after getting the proper key item, but nothing that makes these transitional locations feel impactful to go through. When you do make it to the major locations, you are often greeted by some introductory set piece that helps kickstart the region. These range from being on an on-rail shooting segment while piloting a griffin, trying to get more kills than Ulthane because man needs show how much bigger man is, or helping out the Tormented Gates, which simply involve looking for portals where you have to do combat challenges. Some are fun, and they add a bit more variety to the gameplay, while others are just a little too tedious to get through, and can sometimes make the game feel very disjointed. As for whether any of this holds up, to me, it really doesn't. Because the game tries to borrow so many elements from a lot of other games, especially older titles, and only applies them at such a superficial level, the gameplay never really has any depth or complexity to make it meaningful or substantial. It feels like it's trying to attach all of the best parts that make those other games amazing, but never combines or utilizes them in a way that makes itself unique. Darksiders definitely has a very distinct aesthetic, even with its 15-year age. While the graphics are of the now dated PS3, Xbox 360 era, and the texture models don't have the same level of detail as today, where you can count the number of pores on a person's face, or holes if you're into lizards, Darksiders didn't look too bad for its time. If you consider the bigger graphical contenders for that year, chiefly God of War 3, Red Dead Redemption, and Heavy Rain, I think Darksiders was just a couple of steps behind them in the graphical department. Sure, it didn't have the most realistic looking graphics or ultra high detail, but its comic book inspired art style gave the game and its franchise its distinct look. Many of the various characters and enemy models have very fantasy looking features that fit the whole angels and demons apocalyptic backdrop. War himself is adorned in so much armor and lines that only 1% of his body is a face. Though I think War could have used a bit less armor detail and a more simplistic look to him so that he doesn't look so overly detailed. Maybe a little more Space Marine would have benefited him. Vulgrim's skeleton lich-like figure makes him look so undead and decrepit. The Watcher, most of the demons, and the angels look like they're straight out of a Spawn comic. It all combines into a distinct style that I can only see as Darksiders. The environments are pretty good too, and the apocalyptic ruin of the real world is presented well, along with some other variations like the desert wasteland or the ruins overrun by nature. They all look really good, and they don't feel as separated as some other games where there's a big difference between the actual playable models and the background models. The sound front is pretty good too, but there's a few minor issues that keep it from being great. The game's strongest points are the sound effects as well as the voice acting. In almost every action sequence, there's some really noticeable and emphasized sounds that make every entity and object in the environment feel apparent. You will hear War swinging his sword, enemies attacking, creature effects, as well as everything moving in and around the battlefield. Although I briefly mentioned how the voice acting is a very good accompaniment to the story, the delivery of each character is well done. Most of it does fall into the serious, devious, forlorn, and stoic emotional spectrum for most of the cast, but in the tonal case of Darksiders, this is all very well delivered.
The Watcher is bound to you. It will ensure your loyalty.
Remember that, or I will really get under your skin.
I never imagined that you would be my salvation. Hurry now, before Straga learns of your coming.
When I found you, you said the seventh seal was not broken. I've heard those words before. Abaddon said the same, right before he died.
On the music side, there's a good bit of accompaniment in most of the action and dialogue sequences to add some emotional tone to the scenes. But oddly enough, it's actually really hard to hear. For some reason, the default sound setting has a lot of the effects turned up, and the background music is always drowned out. It's a shame too, because the musical accompaniment does sound very good, and it fits the mood of each scene of Darksiders pretty well, but only when you can hear it.
I was beginning to worry you might not live up to your end of the bargain. Give it to me. How long will you run from Straga?
What did you say, orchestra? I can't hear you over the sound of clang clang. A solid presentation overall, and I do like that the Darksiders aesthetic is very unique to itself, and has even carried the style nearly 2 major games later. While I love how Darksiders tries to distinguish itself with its sense of identity, a lot of its borrowed gameplay mechanics really make it feel underwhelming to play today. You could say recent games have evolved over the years to make the hack and slashing or adventuring more fun to do, thus making games like Darksiders feel a little dated, but there are older games whose combat and adventuring have much greater depth and focus than that of Darksiders. While a lot of those borrowed mechanics are very much a core part of their respective systems, like the hack and slash combat of God of War, or the dungeon exploration system of the Legend of Zelda, it's how those games emphasize those particular elements that make it feel fun to play. Moment-to-moment combat and enemy variety are what makes the gameplay in God of War varied and fun without feeling monotonous. Level and even enemy design are what help make the dungeons of the Legend of Zelda games fun to go through. Darksiders does try to emulate these mechanics, but it falls short of being great, and more just okay. It feels like it has a basic understanding of what makes those games fun, but never enough to apply itself to make it play better than it should. It's by no means a bad game. As a hack and slash adventure, I do find it a bit fun, and it ticks all of the boxes for being a basic action game. If all you really want is an easy adventure with some puzzles where you can swing your big sword without having to think about it, then don't let this video stop you from doing so. There's even a few moments that I think stand out, and I wish there were more gameplay segments of it as well. But in light of the games that came before and after it, as well as how much time has passed, its shallow gameplay depth in many of its systems is more noticeable now than ever. But if you are interested in the world and want to see what there is to see with Darksiders, the characters are entertaining and have a fun, overdramatic, comic book-like charm to it that won't keep you bored. You also at least have this game as well as its sequels to dig into. But from the basis of its entire gameplay, I don't think it's held up particularly well. But that's gonna do it for today, guys. Thanks for sticking around. There will be more games to play and more videos coming soon, so please stay tuned if you'd like to see more. But for now, I'll see you all next time.